Welcome to Legends of Humanity, the global history storytelling channel that brings to life the journeys of extraordinary individuals who changed the world. In today's episode, we step into the life of Winston Churchill, the legendary British leader, an unyielding force during World War II, and one of the most influential voices of the 20th century. From a misunderstood schoolboy to a fearless soldier, a Nobel Prize-winning writer, and the prime minister who led his nation through its darkest hour, he left behind not only a legacy of victory, but a timeless symbol of courage, conviction, and the enduring power of words. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born on November 30, 1874, into one of Britain's most aristocratic families in the grand halls of Blenheim Palace. Though his birthplace echoed with the legacy of dukes and victories, his early life was far from the comfort and affection many might imagine. Winston was the son of Lord Randolph Churchill, a brilliant yet volatile politician, and Jenny Jerome, a glamorous American socialite. Yet, despite the prominence of his lineage, young Winston grew up in a world where love and attention were scarce commodities. From a very young age, Churchill craved connection, but his parents were often emotionally and physically distant. Lord Randolph was stern, cold, and rarely engaged with his son beyond criticism. Jenny, ever absorbed in London's social elite, remained a distant figure in Winston's life. In their absence, it was his nanny, Elizabeth Everest, who became his primary source of comfort. He would later write of her with deep affection, calling her his closest companion during the most fragile years of his life. The emotional void left by his parents would never truly be filled, but it would harden something inside him, a quiet determination to prove his worth. Not to win affection, but to rise beyond it. Churchill's academic record did little to earn the respect of his father. He was considered a poor student, often labeled slow or inattentive. He struggled especially in subjects like Latin and mathematics. He was sent to a series of boarding schools where his reports painted him as rebellious, defiant, and underperforming. In a society where children were expected to follow orders and memorize lines, Winston was a boy who dared to question and resist. His father, embarrassed and disappointed, concluded that Winston was destined for mediocrity at best. In 1888, at the age of 13, Churchill was sent to Harrow School. Even there, his academic troubles continued, but something quietly began to shift. While still struggling in traditional subjects, he discovered a growing interest in the English language reading, writing, and especially public speaking. Though his marks remained poor, his voice began to find shape in essays and debates. He was no longer just a boy with low scores, he was the boy with something to say. Despite his academic failings, Churchill developed an unshakable self-belief. He refused to accept the world's low expectations of him. When his father decided that the only path left was the military, Winston did not protest. Instead, he embraced it with unusual focus. It took him 3 attempts to pass the entrance exam to the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, but on the 3rd try, he succeeded. Not only did he pass, but he placed 20th out of over 100 in outcome no one, least of all his father, expected. What few understood at the time was that Churchill was never meant to follow the straight lines laid out by others. He was not a product of obedience or conventional brilliance. He was a force shaped by rejection, isolation, and criticism, a fire slowly stoked in the dark halls of privilege and cold dormitories. While the world dismissed him as a spoiled failure, Churchill was quietly, fiercely building the one thing no one could take from him, an indomitable will. And so, from the shadows of noble birth but parental indifference, a young man began to rise not because of the titles he inherited, but because of the storms he endured. The boy no one believed in had become a young man determined to leave his mark. After graduating from Sandhurst in 1894, Winston Churchill joined the British Army as a cavalry officer. His first assignment took him to India, a land of dust, heat, and endless contrast. While other officers gambled or chased idle pleasures, Churchill devoured books. From Aristotle to Macaulay, he read like a man possessed, determined to fill the academic void of his youth with knowledge he chose for himself. Between patrols and polo matches, He wrote long letters home, filled with opinions, observations, and political insight that hinted at a deeper ambition, to be more than a soldier. But India was only the beginning. In 1898, Churchill set his sights on another imperial frontier, Sudan. The British Empire was waging a brutal campaign to retake the region from Mahdist rebels. General Herbert Kitchener, a man of cold precision, led the expedition with ruthless efficiency. Churchill was desperate to be part of it, not just for glory, but for something more enduring, a story worth telling. He pulled every string he could. Leveraging his mother's social connections and his own relentless will, he secured dual roles, one as a young officer in the 21st Lancers, the other as a war correspondent for the Morning Post. The journey to Sudan was harsh. The heat was suffocating, the terrain unforgiving, and the threat of ambush constant. But Churchill was undeterred. He studied every movement of Kitchener's army, observed the shifting strategies, and prepared for his moment not just with the sword, but with the pen. On September 2, 1898, at the Battle of Omdurman, Churchill's regiment was ordered to charge. It was one of the last great cavalry charges in British history. What was meant to be a quick sweep turned into chaos. Hidden Mahdist warriors emerged from a dry riverbed, and in an instant, the Lancers were engulfed in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Churchill fought fiercely. He fired his revolver at close range. He narrowly escaped death more than once. His courage under fire, his clarity in the fog of battle, would become legend. But more importantly, he survived and wrote. His dispatches from Sudan were vivid, unflinching, and honest. He praised the bravery of British soldiers, but also criticized the cruelty of the campaign. His writing was not propaganda. It was perspective, something rare in the Empire's narrative. Later that year, Churchill published The River War, a 2-volume account of the Sudan campaign. It was bold, brilliant, and controversial. He questioned imperial policies, criticized Kitchener's destruction of the Mahdi's tomb, and illuminated the grim realities of colonial warfare. For a man barely in his mid-20s, it was an audacious work home that made London take notice. No longer just the troublesome schoolboy or the underachieving son Churchill had become something else entirely. A man of ideas, a voice worth hearing, a name worth remembering. He had risked his life not only for empire, but for words. And the world was beginning to listen. By the dawn of the 20th century, Winston Churchill had seen more of war, politics, and empire than most men twice his age. Yet for all his courage and eloquence, he knew that true power and lasting impact would come not from the battlefield, but from the halls of Parliament. At just 25, armed with stories of Sudan and a pen that had already captured the public's imagination, he set his sights on Westminster. In 1900, Churchill ran for office as a conservative candidate in the industrial town of Oldham. It was not a natural fit. He spoke to working-class audiences about imperial duty, individual ambition, and social fairness, an unusual blend for a man of privilege wearing a stiff collar and a monocle. But it worked. His charm, wit, and undeniable confidence struck a chord. Against the odds, he won. And just like that, Winston Churchill became a member of Parliament. His entrance into the House of Commons was far from quiet. Young, articulate, and fiercely independent, he took the floor with a voice that refused to be ignored. In a chamber where many newcomers took years to find their place, Churchill stood out immediately. His speeches were sharp, often controversial, and always memorable. He criticized his own party's policies when he felt they were unjust, particularly on matters of trade and social welfare. While some hailed him as a rising star, others dismissed him as reckless and arrogant. What truly set Churchill apart, however, was not just his eloquent seat, was his courage to speak what others dared not. He questioned the assumptions of empire, warned against complacency, and challenged the traditional power structures within his own ranks. He did not speak to please. He spoke to provoke, to awaken, and to persuade. And then, in a move that stunned many, he crossed the floor. In 1904, after just 4 years in Parliament, Churchill left the Conservative Party and joined the Liberals. It was a political earthquake. To many in the establishment, he was a Tritora man who had turned his back on the party that gave him his start. But Churchill was unapologetic. He believed in free trade, in reform, in progress. The conservative leadership had grown increasingly reactionary, and he refused to align himself with policies he considered outdated and harmful. Anyone can rat, equipped with characteristic wit, but it takes a certain ingenuity to re-rat. Within the Liberal Party, Churchill found a new platform and new opportunities. In 1905, the Liberals came to power, and Churchill was appointed Under-Secretary of State for the colonies. It was his first government position, a junior role, but it placed him close to decision-making at the highest levels. He handled affairs across the vast British Empire, learning the delicate balances of diplomacy, administration, and power. As he spoke more and learned more, his vision of politics began to evolve. He no longer saw the world as divided simply between rulers and ruled. He began to speak of social justice, of the need for reform, of government's responsibility to the poor and the working class. For a man raised in aristocracy, this was revolutionary. But Churchill was never one to follow the path laid out for him. He carved his own, one word at a time. In Parliament, he was still controversial. Some admired him, others loathed him, but none could ignore him. He was the firebrand with the golden tongue, the young lion prowling the chamber with restless ambition and an ever-growing sense of destiny. By the time the Great War engulfed Europe, Winston Churchill had become one of the most powerful men in Britain. As First Lord of the Admiralty, he commanded the Royal Navy, pride of the British Empire, and carried the weight of the nation's defense on his shoulders. Bold and impatient, he believed in action, in strategy, in reshaping the chessboard of war with vision and daring. He wanted not merely to respond to events, but to shape them. When the Western Front sank into the misery of trenches, barbed wire, and senseless slaughter, Churchill looked elsewhere. He saw on the map a narrow strait, the Dardanelles, a path through Ottoman waters that could lead to victory. If the Allies could seize it, they could open a route to supply Russia, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and perhaps even bring Germany to its knees through a new front. It was daring. It was unorthodox. It was Churchill's idea. He pushed for it relentlessly. Despite skepticism, despite hesitation from generals and politicians, he believed it could work. And so, in early 1915, the plan became action. British and French naval forces steamed into the strait, expecting resistance but trusting in the might of empire. What awaited them was disaster. Mines and hidden artillery turned the waters into a graveyard. Ships were sunk, sailors drowned, and the strait remained closed. Yet the plan continued, shifting from sea to land. Troops were sent to Gallipoli, a narrow, rocky peninsula guarded by fierce Turkish resistance. They landed with bravery but without surprise, and the cliffs became killing grounds. For months, the Allies bled. Mud, disease, and machine gun fire claimed tens of thousands. Hope faded into despair. And back in London, fingers began to point. Churchill, once hailed as a genius of war, became the scapegoat. The press vilified him. His colleagues in government turned cold. Cabinet allies distanced themselves. He had Gambeldan Lostan now. The empire demanded someone to blame. He was forced to resign from the Admiralty, stripped of authority, left adrift in the very war he had tried to win. For a man whose life had been defined by ambition, the fall was devastating. Not just a political failure, it was personal. The shame, the guilt, the crushing silence of exclusion, it burned deeper than any wound. But Churchill did not retreat into comfort. He did not flee into aristocratic exile. Instead, he returned to the trenches not as a minister, but as a soldier. He took command of a battalion of Scots Fusiliers on the Western Front, trading his office for mud, rats, and the constant thunder of artillery. The man once seated at the heart of empire, now crouched in dugouts with men who had never read his books or heard his speeches. There, in the frozen fields of France, he rebuilt himself not with speeches, but with silence, not with orders, but with endurance. History often remembers the triumphant Churchill the Lion's roar, the wartime leader. But this was his crucible, not Gallipoli, not the guns, but what came after: the isolation, the disgrace, the long walk through doubt. And yet, even then, something within him refused to die. The same fire that had driven him through childhood, through cavalry charges, through political storms, still flickered in the dark. He had fallen, but he had not broken. Not yet. The trenches faded, the mud dried, and the war ended. But for Winston Churchill, peace brought no triumph. Though he eventually returned to government in lesser roles, the shadow of Gallipoli lingered, a stain that would not wash off. His name no longer stirred admiration. Instead, it evoked caution, doubt, even ridicule. By the late 1920s, Churchill found himself increasingly out of step with the tide of politics. The empire was shifting, new voices were rising, and his brand of bold defiance seemed antiquated to many. But even as the world moved on, Churchill watched the horizon with unease. Across the channel, something dark was forming. In Germany, a man named Adolf Hitler had begun to rise, a demagogue with burning eyes and venom in his voice. To most, he was just another nationalist shouting into chaos. But Churchill saw more. He read Hitler's words, studied his speeches, tracked the fever growing in German streets. He recognized the rhythm, the march of flags, the intoxicating myth of supremacy, the hunger for vengeance born from defeat in the Great War. He had seen such hatred before, and he understood what would happen if no one stopped it. As the 1930s unfolded, Churchill tried to warn Britain. He gave speeches in Parliament, penned articles in the press, pleaded with his countrymen to open their eyes. Germany was rearming. Treaties were being broken. The drums of war were sounding again, faint but steady. But no one wanted to hear it. The wounds of the last war were still raw. Britain had lost too much. The public craved peace, not prophecy. And Churchill, already sidelined by his own party, was dismissed as a reliquant old warhorse snorting at shadows. They called him alarmist. They mocked his obsession with military preparedness. In the corridors of power, doors quietly closed. Invitations faded. His voice, once so commanding, was now ignored. Even friends urged him to be silent, to let go, to rest. But he would not, because he knew that appeasement would only feed the beast, that looking away would not stop what was coming. And so he stood alone. He watched as Germany marched into the Rhineland in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles' no response. He watched Hitler's speeches grow more violent, his supporters more emboldened, no response. He saw Austria fall, then Czechoslovakia teeter. Still, the world remained frozen in its wishful illusions. Churchill, now a private citizen with no official power, continued to write. His articles were fiery, unfiltered, relentless. He cataloged the German buildup, detailed the Luftwaffe's expansion, called for Britain to rearm. Some listened, most didn't. Yet, he kept going, because the threat was real, because someone had to speak, even into silence. This was Churchill, not as warrior or statesman, but as sentinel, a figure standing in the dark, holding a lantern no one wanted to see. He bore the loneliness, the rejection, the cold. He bore the pain of knowing he was right but being too early to be heard. It was perhaps the most difficult chapter of his life. To see the danger, to sound the alarm, and to be met not with thanks, but with laughter. But he did not stop. He never stopped. Because while the world slept, Winston Churchill kept watch. In May of 1940, the world trembled. France was falling. The Low Countries had crumbled. Nazi tanks rolled across Europe with terrifying speed. Hitler's war machine seemed unstoppable, and Britain stood alone, surrounded by smoke and silence. Inside Parliament, confusion reigned. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, weakened and distrusted, resigned. The government flailed, desperate for leadership in an hour that offered none. Then came a name unwelcome to some, distrusted by many, but burning with urgency: Winston Churchill. He was 70 years old, battle-worn, with a past that divided colleagues and shadowed his reputation. Yet when King George VI summoned him to form a government, Churchill accepted not with celebration, but with solemn resolve. The burden was immense. The stakes, total. Britain would not only need strategy, it would need spirit. And Churchill, more than anyone, understood the power of words in the face of fear. Days after taking office, he addressed the House of Commons. His voice was gravel and thunder, shaped by decades of defeat and defiance. He offered no false comfort, no illusion of ease. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." The chamber fell silent. This was not a man offering promises. He was offering sacrifice. And in doing so, he gave the nation something far rarer, truth. But it was in June, as France collapsed and German invasion loomed, that Churchill gave his most immortal speech. Standing before a nation bracing for bombs, he delivered words that would echo for generations. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." These were not just sentences. They were shields. Each phrase a blow against despair, each repetition a torch passed from voice to voice, street to street, heart to heart. Outside, London prepared for war. Children were evacuated. Gas masks handed out. Barrage balloons rose into the skies. But inside homes and hearts, something had changed. Fear was still present, but no longer alone. Hope, raw and stubborn, had returned. It came not from victory, for none had been won. It came from resolve. From the sense that, in Churchill, Britain had found its iron spine. He worked without pause. Each night he paced bomb shelters and command rooms, cigar in hand, eyes lit with fire. He wrote memos demanding more aircraft, faster ships, better defenses. He met with generals, soothed the king, challenged allies, defied critics. But most of all, he watched the sky not for salvation, but for the storm he knew was coming. The Battle of Britain was on the horizon, but Churchill had already done what was needed first. He had given his people something Hitler could never understand: unity born not of fear, but of choice. Britain did not rally because it was strong. It rallied because one man reminded them that even in the darkest hour, courage is a light no enemy can extinguish. Victory had not yet been won, but the tide was beginning to turn. Britain had survived the Blitz. Hitler had failed to break its spirit, and now the war widened. The United States, once distant and cautious, had been dragged into the fire after Pearl Harbor. The Soviet Union, once indifferent, now bled on the Eastern Front after Hitler's betrayal. And so, history brought together three men who could not have been more different, bound not by friendship, but by necessity: Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin. Churchill had long admired the United States, but he understood that admiration would not win allegiance. America had to be courted carefully, deliberately. And Roosevelt, for all his charm, was a complex partner. Their correspondence began before America entered the war, with letters filled with wit, wisdom, and subtle persuasion. Churchill knew how to speak Roosevelt's language of shared values, shared duty, shared destiny. When the Americans finally joined the fight, it was Churchill who flew across the Atlantic, braving the perils of war to meet Roosevelt face to face. The two men smoked, laughed, and planned. Though their styles clashed, Roosevelt cool and elusive, Churchill fiery and insistent, their bond grew. Together, they became the architects of a global alliance. But it was the third partner, Stalin, who tested Churchill's strength in ways no battlefield ever had. The Soviet leader, brutal and unreadable, ruled by terror and silence. Churchill had spent decades denouncing communism. He distrusted Stalin's motives, feared his ambition. Yet when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Churchill did the unthinkable. He reached out. "If Hitler invaded hell," he said, "I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." The world had changed. Ideology mattered less than survival. The Grand Alliance was forged in urgency. At conferences in Tehran, Yalta, and Moscow, Churchill sat between two giants sown a democratic dreamer, the other a calculating autocrat. He was the oldest of the three, his nation the smallest in might, yet his voice carried weight. He cajoled, warned, negotiated. At every table, he fought to keep Britain relevant, to hold back Soviet domination in Eastern Europe, to shape a post-war world where freedom had a chance to breathe. Often, he found himself alone, Roosevelt seeking harmony, Stalin pushing boundaries, but Churchill stood firm. He argued over troop deployments, over Poland's fate, over the very future of Europe. At Yalta, his eyes were heavy with the burden of choices no man should have to make. He knew Stalin could not be trusted. He feared that victory would birth a new tyranny. But he also knew that without unity, the war would be lost. And so, he compromised just enough to hold the alliance, just enough to win the war. It was a painful dance between principle and pragmatism. Behind closed doors, Churchill's courage was not in roaring speeches, but in quiet resistance. In telling Stalin no when it counted, in reminding Roosevelt that peace must be built on justice, not convenience. He was not naive. He saw the cracks even as he helped paint the wall. But he also knew the stakes. This was not just a war for land. It was a war for the soul of civilization. And when victory finally came, Churchill stood not as a conqueror, but as a bridge between old empires and new powers, between fire and frost, between freedom and fear. He had fought not only with armies, but with words, with reason, with relentless will. And in the darkest rooms of diplomacy, he had been a light no one could ignore. The guns fell silent. Europe lay in ruins, but the tyrant was gone. Across Britain, church bells rang and flags unfurled. People poured into the streets, laughing, crying, singing. The long night was over, and they owed their dawn to one man. Winston Churchill had led them through the darkest hours, refusing surrender, inspiring hope, and delivering victory. His voice had carried them when nothing else could. And now, surely, they would carry him into peace, into rebuilding, into a future he had helped preserve. But history does not always reward its heroes. Just weeks after victory in Europe, Churchill dissolved the wartime coalition and called for a general election. He believed, as did many, that the people would reaffirm their faith in him. After all, he had saved the nation. Who else could now lead it into peace? The campaign began, but the tone had shifted. The nation that had rallied behind Churchill in war now hungered for something else change. The war had exposed deep inequalities. Cities lay bombed and broken. Millions had endured rationing, loss, and sacrifice. Now, they wanted security, housing, jobs. They wanted a new beginning. And Churchill, for all his brilliance, spoke the language of empire, not of everyday lives. His speeches warned of socialism. He spoke of danger and ideology, but the people were tired of danger. They wanted compassion, stability, home. On July 26, 1945, the results were announced. The Labour Party, led by Clement Attlee, had won in a landslide. Churchill, the man who had defied Hitler, who had stood when all others fell, had been rejected, quietly, democratically, undeniably. He did not rage. He did not plead. He simply packed his papers, shook Attlee's hand, and left Downing Street. The cigar was still there, the shoulders still squared. But behind the familiar silhouette walked a man stunned by the swiftness of his dismissal. Outside, people still cheered his name, but their ballots had spoken differently. It was a wound no battlefield had prepared him for. Back in Chartwell, his country estate, Churchill returned to solitude. He painted. He wrote. He stared at the hills and thought of all he had seen of charges in Sudan, speeches in Parliament, bombs over London, and now, silence. It was not bitterness he carried, but bewilderment. How could victory feel so much like defeat? Yet even in loss, he did not collapse. He believed in the judgment of democracy, even when it wounded him. And he knew that his service was not measured by titles held, but by trials endured. Power, after all, was never the goal. Britain's survival was, and for that, he had already given the best of himself. He had been cast aside once, but Winston Churchill was not a man easily forgotten. Even in political exile, his voice lingered in books, in essays, in whispers of what might come next. And though the war had ended, he knew peace was an illusion. A new struggle was rising colder, quieter, but no less dangerous. While the world rejoiced in the fall of fascism, Churchill saw the shadow behind the victory, the iron will of the Soviet Union, closing its fist around Eastern Europe. In 1946, invited to speak at Westminster College in Missouri, Churchill stood beside President Truman and delivered a speech that would shape the future. His words were calm, measured, and chilling. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, he declared, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent." It was not a call to war, but a Werninga map drawn in metaphor, marking a division that would soon define the age. The phrase, "Iron Curtain," echoed across the Atlantic, stirring both outrage and awakening. Some accused him of warmongering. Others finally saw what he had long feared, that totalitarianism had not died with Hitler, but been reborn behind red banners and closed borders. Churchill, though out of office, became once more a sentinel watching, speaking, urging vigilance. He championed unity between Britain and the United States, calling for a fraternal association that could guard the free world. He knew that diplomacy would now require not just strength, but alignment of ideals, of resolve, of vision. 5 years after the war, in 1951, the British people called him back. At 77, Churchill became prime minister again, not as a wartime lion, but as an elder statesman facing a fractured world. The Cold War had begun. Korea was burning. The nuclear age had dawned. And Churchill, though aged and weary, rose once more, to lead not into battle, but into balance. This second premiership was quieter, more cautious. He sought to preserve peace through strength, to guide Britain through the storms of reconstruction while keeping an eye fixed firmly on the East. He met with Eisenhower, monitored Moscow, and worked to keep Britain a relevant voice in a world now shaped by superpowers. But time does not wait, even for titans. His health declined. Words came slower, thoughts heavier. The fire within had not dimmed, but the body that carried it had begun to fade. In 1955, he resigned, this time for good, not with fanfare, but with the quiet dignity of a man who had given all that history had asked of him. Yet, even in farewell, Churchill's presence remained. He had named the storm before it came. He had drawn the first lines of the Cold War, not with bombs or bullets, but with truth. And while others maneuvered, postured, or hesitated, he had once again done what he always had, looked into the dark and spoken. He had walked through war and worn the crown of power, spoken to kings and soldiers alike, and stood firm where others had fallen. And yet, Winston Churchill's greatest legacy was not just what he did, but what he meant. Long after the speeches faded and the smoke of battle cleared, his words endured, his courage endured. His very being became a symbol not just of a nation, but of an age. In 1953, Churchill was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, not for one book or one speech, but for the vast, living archive of insight, history, and language he had built across decades. He had written of war and peace, of empire and democracy, of memory and destiny, and he had done so not as a scholar in isolation, but as a man who lived inside the very storms he described. His prose was not detached, it was blood and thunder, inked by someone who had held a sword in one hand and a pen in the other. He was not merely recording history, he was part of it. He was shaping it. In his final years, Churchill became quieter. He withdrew from public life, spending his days painting, writing, walking the gardens of Chartwell. He still smoked his cigars, still carried the posture of a man who had once carried the world, but his voice grew softer. His world, once defined by urgency and fire, began to slow, and yet the world did not forget him. Statues rose across cities. His books were translated, studied, quoted. Children learned his name not from textbooks alone, but from the echoes of those who still remembered how he had held the line when all seemed lost. His speeches, those thunderous calls to courage, were played in classrooms, in ceremonies, in moments of national remembrance. Even those who had once doubted him came to see what time always reveals. Greatness is rarely comfortable, but it is always necessary. Winston Churchill died on January 24, 1965, exactly 70 years to the day after the death of his father. His funeral drew kings, presidents, veterans, and ordinary citizens. They came not just to mourn a man, but to honor a spirit. He had been called many things: bulldog, statesman, warmonger, savior, but above all, he had been a voice that never wavered, even when the sky fell. And so he passed not into silence, but into legacy. In the long corridors of time, there are names that flicker and fade. But there are a few, very few, that remain. Names that are not just remembered, but felt. Names that remind us that even in the darkest hours, one voice can matter, one life can turn the tide. One man can become a century. Churchill was that man. You've just listened to the extraordinary journey of Winston Churchill, Britain's wartime icon and one of the greatest figures in human history. Subscribe to Legends of Humanity and join us as we explore the lives of remarkable individuals from every corner of the globe, from leaders and scientists to philosophers, artists, and unsung heroes who left an everlasting mark on humanity. Legends of Humanity, where history becomes an eternal source of inspiration.